of AML Conversations. I'm John Byrne with AML Right Source. Today we have Ashleigh I'll probably screw that up, Montgomery, Subramanian, I'm sorry. But Ashleigh and I have worked together for a number of years. She's with the Charity and Security Network. They are an advocacy group for nonprofits, humanitarian groups, all sorts of areas of the economy, both domestically and globally. And one of the main reasons we want to talk to Ashleigh today, she has just authored with a number of contributors a report that's posted on the Charity and Security Network website, as well as through LinkedIn, on an area of concern, one of the major areas of concern for the humanitarian world, and that is trying to get clarity, trying to get what they call a carve-out to a UN resolution. So what I'm going to do, Ashleigh, before we get started with that, because I want to talk about the report, I want to talk to you. I know the good news is there's been success, so I want you to talk about that. But also, can you explain to the audience, again, we've had some of your predecessors on before, what the Charity and Security Network mission is and what they do?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much, John, for having me on. I'm thrilled to be here. So our mission at the Charity and Security Network, we were founded in late 2008 to try and look at and assess how the US's counterterrorism laws and policies and measures impact civil society. So we look at this from the US side. We also look at how the UN counterterrorism measures, how the Financial Action Task Force, the FATF level, AML-CFT measures impact civil society. So we support humanitarian, peace building, and human rights organizations operating all over the world, and trying to find ways to solve how these counterterrorism measures might impact their work.
And as we know, and as our community knows, the challenge for AML professionals is, on the one hand, because of the dramatic increase, certainly pre and post 9/11, of terrorist activity around the globe, whether it's the form of just terrorist acts or the movement of terrorist funds, movement of illicit funds to commit criminal acts, and of course, the need to ensure that there's financial access to our partners in the humanitarian world. It becomes a difficult balancing act. And I think having organizations like yours point out sometimes what I would call the unintended effects, sometimes the collateral damage that's not clearly anticipated, it really becomes important. And we'll talk toward the end of this. I think the good news is there's been definitely a number of stakeholder projects and there's been connections, but it's still a very difficult way to navigate. So let's get into the specifics. The UN resolution, I want you to describe the carve-out, and then your report, which the title is A Study on the Impacts of UN Security Council Resolution on Financial Institutions and Donors, as I said, is available on your website. But what is that resolution carve-out, and talk a bit about that process?
Sure. So the resolution you're referring to, John's UN Security Council Resolution 2664, and this was passed in December 2022. And what it did was to create a humanitarian carve-out to asset freeze measures across existing and new UN sanctions regimes. So what it did was essentially create a safeguard for humanitarian action, which is something that civil society had really to have something like this carve out for more than a decade. I think at the beginning stages of this advocacy, civil society was told that a resolution like this was impossible, it would never happen, was a complete no-go. But with persistent advocacy and kind of documenting why it was so important, advocacy, research, policy engagement, the impossible finally became the possible. So the resolution created this humanitarian carve-out. The co-pen holders at the time when it was passed were Ireland and the US. And as with most Security Council resolutions, even those on sanctions and on counterterrorism, Resolution 2664 was passed as open-ended, a standing application. But the application of the humanitarian carve-out to the 1267 ISIL al-Qaeda regime, which is essentially the UN's counterterrorism regime, was time-bound for an initial 2-year period. So what this meant was that if the Security Council didn't renew the application of the carve out to the 1267 regime on or before December 9th of this year, that portion of the resolution would have expired. And that is really, really key for the humanitarian sector, because the application of the resolution to the 1267 regime was really the most important part of the resolution, because there's over 100 million people in need of life-saving aid in countries or areas of countries where ISIL and Al-Qaeda have a presence and where they operate. So without the 1267 component, aid to these over 100 million people, which is, a huge number, would have really been jeopardized and likely just not have been able to be delivered, and that humanitarian action would have been cut off. So that's where kind of an overview of 2664. So now with the 1267 component that was, needed to be renewed on or before December 9th, just about a week ago. Thankfully, the Security Council resolution on December 6th voted via a new resolution, Resolution 2761, that the application of the humanitarian carve-out will be applied to the 1267 regime as a standing application, which essentially just means it was extended indefinitely, so it's not time-bound in nature and just lives on, which is great.
Yes, that was the key, right? That it's not time-bound.
Exactly.
Can you give me an example? I've talked about this on previous conversations, and I know I've mentioned this probably to you a couple of times. But when I first heard about all these issues about 7, 8, 9 years ago, when we were involved with a project with the World Bank, and I was at the time with ACAM, so we had roughly 100 people from all parts of this community. And I remember specifically, we're going to talk about Syria toward the end of this. I remember an individual who represented the Syrian Relief Fund, or some version of that, who stood up and said, in some cases, when financial institutions are sending funds or allowing loans or whatever, there are still some hurdles. There's still some things that occur. And so medical supplies, water, utilities, all those sorts of things get, I don't say slow walked on purpose, but it takes a while. And then he said to all of us, and people die. I don't think any statement resonated more with our community than that one. Give us some examples in the past 2 years from the positive side of what this carve out has meant from your folks' perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really important question, and it's I think that statement, it's unfortunately really true, because a lot of the aid in the areas where 1267 entities operate is where folks are in need of life-saving aid. So think Afghanistan, Yemen, Lebanon, the Sahel, these types of places where it really can be life or death. So some of the positive impacts we've seen is there was a lot of concern from certain member states that the resolution would cause an increase in aid diversion. And there's really been no evidence that has happened. So that's positive, not only looking at in terms of Resolution 2664, but in terms of kind of showing that humanitarian carve-outs writ large, don't cause any increase in aid diversion, and that civil society, NPOs, NGOs continue to have really strong internal self-regulatory measures and controls, strong risk mitigation and due diligence measures and procedures in place. The resolution, another positive impact is that it's really reduced tensions between humanitarian assistance, IHL or international humanitarian law, and sanctions, which is pretty significant because prior to the resolution, these were usually these frameworks were really at odds with one another, and it's been able to reduce these tensions and create more of a harmonization across these frameworks. Some member states, like the EU, the UK, and the US, have transposed the humanitarian carve-out within their own domestic UN sanctions implementation frameworks, which is a requirement of the resolution. But, the US did it just days after the resolution was passed. So some states really took very quick action. And then another really positive and kind of exciting is that a number of states also implemented the resolution across their autonomous non-UN sanctions regimes. And this is really significant as this wasn't a requirement. The resolution doesn't require member states to adopt carve-outs in their autonomous sanctions regimes. But, same, the EU, the UK, and the US all did that. So it kind of went beyond what was required. And then finally, one thing that we've really seen that's great is that it seems like this resolution, in addition to other carve-outs and sanctions exceptions that we've seen over the years, we've really gotten to a point where it's been able to set a new international norm that sanctions regimes should include humanitarian carve-outs to protect humanitarian action.
The report that you put together based on the survey results, let's talk a bit about that. Sort of both the key findings and then also your recommendations. As I said before, I think that the financial sector certainly is more aware than 7-8 years ago in terms of the collateral damage that can occur when you're dealing with counterterrorism. But obviously, there's still quite a bit more to be done. What did you find from the survey? Give us some of the highlights, both from the financial institution respondents and the donor respondents.
Sure, I'd be really delighted to. So maybe just to say first, Charity and Security Network commissioned this study because what we'd found in our advocacy meetings with member states and UN entities and, speaking with fellow civil society organizations was that there was relatively good documentation and you could see the positive impacts that the resolution was having on the humanitarian sector and that it was enabling more humanitarian aid and access, which is great. It's the whole purpose of the resolution. But there wasn't really anything yet on how the resolution was impacting both the financial sector and the donor sector. So we just kind of identified this as a research gap and wanted to try and fill that gap. So some of the key findings for the financial sector side was that about half of the financial institutions, and we took financial institutions to be pretty wide, not just banks, but MSBs, fintechs, the whole gamut. So about half of the respondents that filled out the survey were familiar with the resolution, and 75% of financial institutions, really, which is the pretty high number, stated that they're now more comfortable, or at least somewhat more comfortable. So we this is combining those who said that they were more comfortable and those who said they're somewhat more comfortable processing humanitarian transactions to countries or areas within countries due to the resolution that they didn't have this level of comfort transacting in before. Another key finding was that the resolution, financial institutions felt that the resolution hasn't been sufficiently socialized yet. So there needs to be, a lot more just awareness. What is the resolution? How does it impact financial institutions? What does it mean to them and this sector, and how can they best utilize it? And then the actor that was identified as most important to sensitization were regulators. So that's kind of who financial institutions and donors actually are both hoping can bring this awareness about the resolution. Another finding was that financial institutions identified they have a much deeper both level of familiarity with and understanding of OFAC's baseline general licenses than with the resolution. And that the OFAC general licenses have a much more significant impact on financial institutions' internal processes and making changes to these processes than the resolution does. So that's maybe not surprising, but one of the key findings there.
Yeah, I would just say on that, it's not surprising at all to me because the large multinational institutions, certainly their sanctions people are well aware of UN sanctions in addition to OFAC. But many mid-sized, smaller, and probably a lot of fintechs, because a lot of those folks are still getting up to speed on not all of them, but on AML related topics. So that response doesn't surprise me. And to your overall point, that's why we're helping you by doing this interview and some other things. Just got to make people more aware that this has
Exactly.
impact. And then part of that, as you said, is on the regulators to explain that the carve out to the UN resolution and is a positive and that sort of so I can understand why there was some gap in knowledge, but B, why so much more needs to be done. Not putting it all on the regulators, but certainly again, given my understanding of our community, which is I've known for decades, the larger institutions probably they could sit here and ask you a bunch of very detailed questions about the resolution. Many others probably not.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. So a few of the other findings, that a quarter of respondents noted that a standing application might have an impact or would have an impact on their engagement with humanitarian actors and their willingness to process humanitarian transactions. So that's great because that's what this new resolution did. So hopefully, we'll see an increase there in the coming year. And then half of respondents noted that the resolution has had a medium level impact. And this was just kind of looking, was it a high level impact, a low level, a medium level impact on their risk appetite and due diligence procedures. So again, now that we've got this new resolution and the standing application, looking forward to seeing how that might change in the coming years. And then finally, for financial institutions, what they identified that would be most beneficial beyond just mere sensitization, which we know is really important, but kind of, asking them what else could be done, is they noted that what would be most beneficial is government enacting no action or non-enforcement policies. And these, they noted what these could and hopefully should include would be pronouncements or policy changes that make it very clear that banks won't be penalized, safe harbors for transactions, which I know, John, something we've talked about for a long time now, expanding sanctions carve-outs for financial institutions via non-enforcement postures or issuing additional general licenses, and then creating regulatory leeway in AML-CFT and anti-bribery regulations, and finally, softening liability for banks and for sanctions officers.
Those recommendations they're always relevant, but I think particularly now because the regulators and policymakers that pushed through the AMLA law from a couple of years ago are saying by the passage of that and by some comments that there should be a clearer what's known as a risk-based approach.
Exactly.
Because while that's been out there for quite a number of years, many of us are a little skeptical that that's actually how the regulators look at this. So this would be a perfect example where, banks are trying to, process funds that are designed to help humanitarian work in conflict zones. And if they've made a mistake because of a licensing issue or whatever, it's not reckless disregard for the laws and regulations. It's done in good faith. And so to give, if not a safe harbor, but some way that the bank would not be liable if they could show that their processes were a risk-based process, then this could definitely help your community as well as help the financial sector. So I'd be a little optimistic that maybe there's a shot because we are trying to revamp the whole infrastructure, and this would be a perfect example of how to do that and not get away from the mission, which is to counter terrorist financing.
Exactly. And like I said, with resolution 2761, it's just the perfect opportunity to be able to implement and enact all of this. So really exciting.
Let me give you an opportunity to talk a little bit also about your recommendations for donors as well. And then I want to tie this up by asking you about what's going on in Syria right now. But talk to us a bit about donors, because obviously they're concerned about getting caught up in what would be an unintentional donation to an organization that is considered sanctions or what have you. Tell us a bit about the donor response to your survey and some of your recommendations.
Sure. So donors were less familiar with the resolution than financial institutions were, kind of significantly less familiar. So that, led us to see that the resolution was not socialized sufficiently, at least not yet. So that was another finding. They also noted regulators as the actor that they'd like to be most responsible for this sensitization. There was, from the donor responses, donors did indicate that the carve-out has reduced the risk of sanctions breaches for partners in certain contexts, which then enabled confidence in donors programming a wider range of activities, so in relevant contexts. So that was great to see. Again, kind of, the standing application would be helpful for over half of the donors that responded. So that's great since that happened. And then what donors noted beyond sensitization, that what would be most helpful for them is legal and policy change. And they, that kind of differ. There's what this meant for different donors kind of depended on the type of donor. So for government donors, they thought that creating incentives for the financial sector to adopt a risk-based approach, as you just noted, legislative changes to counterterrorism policies. These would be some of the really helpful things for government donors. For funder affinity groups, they noted basically they need a stronger baseline understanding of what the resolution is and what it means to the philanthropic community writ large. For public charities, they wanted, this won't be a surprising one either, better dialogue between regulators, government agencies, and financial institutions. And finally, international foundations thought that communication, legal change, and more assurances from government entities would be helpful there. And then in terms of recommendations, obviously our maybe biggest recommendation was for the Security Council to renew the application of the humanitarian carve-out to the 1267 regime as a standing application. We're obviously thrilled that happened. Recommendation both on the financial institution and the donor sector side is for regulators to engage more in these sensitization efforts. And what was really noted from the financial institutions is what would be most helpful. A most helpful way to do this would be explanatory one-pagers. So just simple documents highlighting here's what this means, here's how it applies to you, here's what's authorized. So that's what they identified would be most useful. And then another recommendation from the financial institution side that governments and regulators should collaborate to enact these no action, non-enforcement policies that I noted before. And then in terms of, the recommendations were similar on the donor side, just, how can governments and regulators should enact legal and policy change that I noted before. And then finally, there's really a cross-cutting recommendation across both the financial institutions and the donor sector. And this is that policymakers must create coherency across policy, legal, and regulatory frameworks. And what I mean by this is that we have to find ways to address the policy incoherence that can exist across the complex legal and regulatory web of sanctions frameworks, AML-CFT regulations, and states' national counterterrorism legislation, including in the U.S. context, the material support statutes. So really making changes to these existing laws and regulatory frameworks at the national level, at the multilateral level, at the FATF and UN level, to ensure that these frameworks and regulations safeguard and promote, rather than what we see now, which is that they sometimes undermine and prevent humanitarian action. And a reason this is really important is that it would enable better and more full operationalization of Resolution 2664.
Oh, that's great. I would just say in general, the AML community interest in the issue of de-risking financial access, that you folks have done a lot in that space. So they should go to your website for more information on that. You're involved in a lot of stakeholder dialogues, I know, to deal with an issue that we all care about. I want to end on this, actually a two-parter. One is the first question would be, what other resources besides signing up for your newsletter and some other things should the AML community consider? And then if you wouldn't mind we're recording this about a week before Christmas holidays, and obviously Syria is in the news for obvious reasons. And maybe give us an update on how the humanitarian community is addressing what's going on in Syria. But first of all, just what other places can bankers and fintech execs and investigators continue to stay on top of these issues that you folks are so involved in?
Yeah, so I appreciate you saying signing up for a newsletter. I think that's always a great way. Checking out our website. We part of what we do is we're a resource center, so we're always trying to put out kind of up to date, explanations of general licenses or different regulations or changes across counterterrorism or AML CFT measures. You can always become a member of the Charity and Security Network as well. And then that would, give you access to our member meetings. And we do a weekly opportunities newsletter that kind of is the most late breaking and pressing information or events or resources within our community. So would invite you to look at that. Also,
in Syria. So let's talk
Syria,
about at Syria.
Yeah, so Syria, it's a great question. One thing that I think all of the partners that we've talked to find challenging is that it's just so, the context right now is so fluid that folks are struggling to understand, what are they allowed to do? Who can they engage with? Who can they not engage with? One thing that's really causing a lot of confusion is this language of the government of Syria. So who do we mean by the government of Syria now in existing authorizations and general licenses? Obviously, this when these were drafted, it was to be applied to the Assad regime. Now that there is no Assad regime, does it mean HTS? Does it mean other entities? Who do we mean by government of Syria? So getting clarity on that is one thing that we're really looking to. And then another key point, I think, is that HTS is designated as both a foreign terrorist organization or an FTO, and especially designated global terrorist or an SDGT. The FTO designation, then, when we have that, that invokes a material support statute, which, if you run afoul of, can be really high fines and fees and really pretty intense criminal liability and potential jail time. So that alone can make folks really, really hesitant, understandably, to engage anyone that's designated as an FTO. So we at Charity and Security Network, we really promote removing the FTO designation so that humanitarian aid and access can flow to the Syrian people. And we could still maintain the SDGT designation so that there's still some level of designation on HTS. And we have precedent for this because this SDGT designation is what we have for the de facto authorities in Yemen and the de facto authorities in Afghanistan. So it's kind of really in alignment with what we see in other contexts. It's obviously each context is its own, but there's precedent. It would align with what we see in other contexts.
I really appreciate you taking the time today, Ashleigh Subramanian-Montgomery, who is the Senior Director of Policy Advocacy at the Charity and Security Network. And I would urge folks to sign up for the newsletter, to consider joining the organization. We in the AML community really need you to keep us, I won't say keep us honest, but keep us understanding some of these impacts. And of course, we all share the view that we could work together with the regulators. I will say that I think the regulators, the banking regulators, have really tried, and they've actually issued some good statements and documents and things, but obviously more needs to occur. So, and then this is not just a U.S. issue, as you know better than anyone. It's a internationally global challenge. So I know FATF has spoken on this. I know you guys have some, not you specifically, but some of the folks in your community have not, I don't want to say question FATF, but maybe there needs to be some adjustment on how the recommendations are handled. That we'll leave that for another time, because I think that's also an interesting issue. So Ashleigh, thank you so much for your time today. Have a safe holiday season, and we'll stay connected with these issues, and hopefully have you back to see if there's some improvement or some other things that you want to make sure the AML community is aware of. So thanks so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, John, and thanks for being such a great ally to civil society over the years. Really grateful for that.